Goedemorgen, namens Happiness, welkom. Mijn naam is Julika Marijn. Ook zie dat er nog een hele scheut mensen binnenkomt. Heel goed, kom lekker zitten. We zijn nog niet begonnen. Straks krijgen jullie een talk van de Amerikaanse designer Ingrid Fetell Lee. En zij is expert in vrolijkheid. Zijn jullie al een beetje vrolijk? Ja toch? Best een vrolijk festival so far. Zij schreef er ook een boek over. Het ziet er ook heel vrolijk en prachtig uit. Vrolijkheid. En deze designer ontdekte dat er heel veel alledaagse dingen zijn die ons vrolijk maken. Dingen zoals confetti, schilderijen, boomhutten, discodips op een ijsje, lollies, zwembaden, vuurwerk, nou noem maar op. En deze gigantische lijst die ze kreeg nadat ze daar onderzoek naar had gedaan, die heeft ze teruggebracht tot een top 10 van vrolijkheid. En ze gaat ons vandaag leren en vertellen hoe we die alledaagse vreugde en vrolijkheid weer terug kunnen vinden in ons leven. Geef haar een warm applaus, Ingrid Fetell Lee. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you
The
so
stage
much.
is yours.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for having me. Okay, so we're going to be talking about joy today. And rather than just talk about it, I thought we would start with a little experience of it. So if you're willing to do this with me, I want to try something really quickly. So what I would love you to do is to please stand up. Great. Okay, so what I'm going to ask you to do is to find your own unique happy dance. And so a happy dance, it's not choreographed, it's not professional. No one's going to have to come up here and do this with me. I'll do this up here by myself, and you all can do it down there. So no pressure. It's really just an expression of the joy that you find inside of yourself at this moment, and letting that come out. And of course, it would only be fair if I gave you a little inspiration. So, if you don't know how to do a happy dance, here are some models that you can take inspiration from. There's, the classic Carlton, which is like great. You can do like Brad Pitt and get the upper body into it. You can, if you have space, but be mindful of your neighbors, you can do like Batman and Robin, but just move into the aisle if you really want to get the legs into it like that. So choose a move that feels good to you. We're going to do this just for a minute. When you hear the music, you can start your happy dance. All right? Let's go. Okay.
It might seem crazy what I'm about to say. Sunshine, she's here. You can take a break. I'm a hot air balloon that could go to space. With the air, like I don't care, baby, by the way. Because I'm happy. Clap along if you feel like a room without a roof. Because I'm happy. Clap along if you feel like happiness is the truth. Because I'm happy. Clap along if you know what happiness is to you. Because I'm happy. Clap along if you feel like that's what you want to do.
Thank you. All right. Thank you so much for doing that. You can have a seat. Okay. So, I'm out of breath. Thank you so much for doing that with me. Those were amazing happy dances. Not that anyone's judging, but they were amazing. So, why do I have you do that to begin a talk about joy? Well, I think a big part of it for me is that I think we pursue happiness. And, certainly across Western cultures, this seems to be true, that we pursue happiness and we often overlook joy. We miss these little moments of joy in our day-to-day lives. And I think a happy dance is one experience or expression of that. There are other things that also come up in the course of a happy dance. I'll touch on those as we go on. But I think it might be worth taking a moment to pull these two ideas apart, happiness and joy, because we often use those ideas interchangeably, those words interchangeably in our culture. So happiness is a broad evaluation of how we feel about our lives over time. And so if you were to think about how happy you are right now on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the ideal life that you could be living, and 1 being like the worst life that you could imagine yourself being living right now, and you were to just sort of try to figure out where you are, we don't just like snap our fingers and go, I'm a 7, right? We have to think about it. It's a conscious reflection, because there are many different factors that go into happiness. How we feel about our work, whether we feel like we have a sense of meaning and purpose in our lives, how connected we feel to other people, our health. All of those things go into how happy we feel. But joy is much smaller and simpler. So the way that psychologists define joy is as an intense, momentary experience of positive emotion. And we can measure the feeling of joy through direct physical expressions, things like smiling and laughter and a feeling of wanting to jump up and down. So the happy dance, in a lot of ways, is a perfect sort of a discrete experience of joy. It's quick and you feel it. And you feel it not just in your mind, but you feel it in your bodies. We feel a sense of expansion often in a state of joy. We feel a sense of lightness, maybe. We feel this desire to throw our arms up in the air. All of those things come with this feeling of joy. And I think this is important because so often when we think about what things feel like, we know what anxiety feels like, for example, right? If you think about, if I were to ask you, what does anxiety feel like in your body? You can immediately pinpoint that feeling of anxiety. But we forget that joy has a feeling too. That joy, actually, we can feel it in our bodies. We can notice more of these little moments of joy. So for me, I think it's a shame that we focus so much on this big idea of happiness and we overlook these little moments of joy, because these little moments actually have surprisingly big effects. So I want to share a few of these effects that research has shown that joy can affect in our lives. So the first is that joy attracts. All our emotions are contagious, right? They spread to one another. That's another thing that's wonderful about the happy dance is you have the contagion of all our gestures, right? Our tone of voice, our movements, our facial expressions, all of those things spread joy to one another and spread all our emotions to one another. And the power of this is that, surprisingly, it can actually make us more attractive. Because if we know that someone's joy is going to rub off on us, we want to be with them. So it draws us toward them. And this actually, it actually makes us more physically attractive. So studies have shown, this is a study scientists did where they took they made these computer-generated composite faces. And they made they took faces that they said were average looking, and they made them smiling. And then they took above average looking faces, really good looking, sort of model good looking faces, and they made them stony faced, not smiling. And what they found is that when the faces seemed to be exhibiting genuine joy, they were considered more attractive. The average looking faces were considered more attractive than the really good looking faces. So we are more physically attractive to other people when we exhibit our joy. Joy also sharpens our minds. So I think we often think about joy as a distraction from work, right? It's something we do on our weekends, on our nights. It's not something we do in the middle of the workday. But in fact, research shows that when we experience joy, when we experience small moments of joy, we make better decisions. Business people make better decisions in a state of joy. And they take into account a greater variety of scenarios in the process of making that decision. Joyful leaders have more engaged teams, and they complete their work in a more coordinated way with less effort than leaders who are not necessarily joyful. Joyful negotiators reach more win-win agreements than negotiators who are in a neutral state. And we are up to 12% more productive in a state of joy. So I think this idea that joy takes us away from success is actually a myth. In fact, it can be a catalyst for our success. Joy also opens us up to new ideas. So one of the primary theories of the evolution of positive emotion is called broaden and build. And the idea behind this theory is that negative emotions evolved to narrow our focus, to help us think about immediate problems and challenges. So for example, if you hear a noise in the middle of the night, you hear a sound go bump, what happens? All of your senses are tuned to that event. You're not thinking about what you're going to have for breakfast tomorrow or where you're going on vacation. You're thinking about, what is that noise? Where did it come from? Is it dangerous? And what do I do about it? So negative emotions like fear, anger, those things narrow our focus in to enable us to deal with those problems. But positive emotions do the opposite. Positive emotions broaden out our focus. They help us learn, explore, grow, play, and connect, build resources for future opportunities. And one of the really important measures of this is called cognitive flexibility. So our minds are more adaptable, they're more flexible. We're able to come up with a greater range of ideas when we're in a state of joy than when we're in a neutral state. So our creativity is also heightened by having these positive emotions. Joy also strengthens relationships. So I always say, if you're going to go on a first date with someone, the best thing you can do is go to a comedy club or a funny movie or do something that makes the other person laugh. Because when you laugh together, research shows that we're more likely to share more personal information with each other. So it helps us get below the surface. Laughter functions as a kind of icebreaker that helps us talk about things like things we might be embarrassed about, or things that maybe, things we struggled with, things that help us get below that surface of that small talk and actually form deeper bonds with other people. So in a way, laughter primes us to be more vulnerable, to feel safe being vulnerable with other people. And when we celebrate together, when we celebrate small, joyful moments in the everyday, research shows that deepens the trust in our relationships, the sense of intimacy, the sense of connection, and our overall satisfaction with our relationships. So just sharing someone's joy and sort of almost mirroring it back to them can be a way to form deeper bonds. And lastly, joy makes us more resilient. So there's studies that show, I think, often we think that in a trying time, in a difficult time, we don't have time for joy, right? It's something that, you have a big deadline at work. You don't have time to do something joyful. You have to focus on getting through it. But what I think has happened to many of us is that as work has bled out into the rest of our lives, we're living not in a state of where stress spikes and then restores and then spikes and then restores. We're living in a state of chronic stress. We're stressed out all the time. And that doesn't let our bodies or our minds recover. And what happens when we have little moments of joy, research shows that helps reset the stress effects on our cardiovascular system. So it decreases cortisol, blood pressure, and it lets the body, it gives sort of breathing space to the body and the mind to allow us to then ramp back up when we need to deal with challenges. So little moments of joy can help aid our resilience. There's also research that shows that in a difficult time, such as when we're grieving or going through something really serious, that little moments of joy can help us find more perspective in those difficult events that helps us cope and bounce back over the long haul. So in many ways, I think joy can be a tool for our resilience. So I think, often when we focus on happiness, it takes us away from joy, right? So when we focus on happiness, we are, working so hard to get that promotion that we stop spending time with our families, or we don't do our hobbies. We don't do those little things. We rush through the moment to get to those things that we think are really important. And yet, that often makes us feel less happy. But ironically, when we focus on these little moments of joy, it unlocks a series of changes that adds up to happiness in the long run. So I like to say, when we focus on joy, happiness finds us. And I should probably take a minute to go back and explain how I got here and how I ended up studying joy because, of course, I didn't set out to study joy. I set out to study design. And you've heard from my bio that I'm a designer by background. And what's a designer doing studying joy? And it all goes back to a moment in my first year of design school when I was at a review, the end of my first year, and a professor said, "Your work gives me a feeling of joy." And I thought, well, that's weird. I mean, it was weird for a number of reasons. One, because I hadn't really tried to design joy. It wasn't what I was trying to do. I was trying to create sustainable and very practical products. So the fact that I had designed joy by accident was interesting. But it was also weird because I think, like many people, I had been raised to believe that joy is this ephemeral feeling. It's this elusive, fleeting, intangible thing. And I was raised to believe that we find joy within, and that we're not supposed to put any weight in material things, that we're not supposed to care too much about stuff, right? That's not important. And so the idea that tangible things could create this intangible feeling of joy was really strange to me. So I asked the professors to explain, and they couldn't do it. And so this sent me off on a journey to try to understand what is the connection between this mysterious and elusive feeling of joy and the physical world. And what I found is that there's actually a substantial body of research that has really been overlooked by the field of psychology, because the field of psychology has historically been focused on our attitudes, our behaviors, our neurochemistry, the stuff that's happening inside of us. That's where that discipline has focused for a century. And there's been very little attention to what's happening around us and how that influences our emotions and our well-being. And this growing body of research, I think, is something that we can use. It's something we can use to help us cultivate happier and healthier lives. So when I left that review and I was trying to figure out where to get started, I put this question out. I said, where does joy come from? If joy can come from tangible things, then where? Where does it come from? And I just started talking to people. I started talking to people I met on the street. I went out into the middle of Rockefeller Center in New York City with a clipboard, and I just started asking people about the things and places that brought them joy. And I noticed that at first, of course, there are certain things that are personal, right? We all have things that bring us joy that are very unique to us and personal. For me, the wallpaper on my grandmother's kitchen, if I see a pattern that looks like that, I'm going to have an immediate feeling of joy, and that might not do anything for anyone else in this room, but because that's very personal. We all have those things. But there are also things that, as I was talking to people, seemed to come up again and again and again. And there are things like cherry blossoms and bubbles. Everywhere you go on Earth, babies smile at bubbles. It's one of the sort of intriguing things. Swimming pools and tree houses. Hot air balloons and googly eyes. Rainbows and rainbow sprinkles. There's something about these things that cuts across lines of age and gender and ethnicity. They're not joyful for just a few people. They're joyful for nearly everyone. They're universally joyful. And when I saw them all together, it gave me this incredibly hopeful feeling. Because I think that the world we live in often has a way of focusing on our differences and magnifying those differences. We learn that we're right-brained or left-brained, that we're introvert or extrovert. We learn that we're an Aries or an Aquarius or a Taurus, and that those things make us different. And I think those frameworks can be really useful, right? They help us understand ourselves in a deeper way. But at the same time, I think they often also make our differences seem so stark as to be insurmountable. And so the idea that underneath it all, we all find joy in some of these same things was really comforting to me. It means there's something underneath it all that unites us, and that thing is much lighter and in some ways sillier than we expect. But I still needed to know what it was about these things that made them so joyful. I had pictures of them up on the wall of my studio, and every day I would come in and look at them and try to make sense of it. And one day, something just clicked. I saw all these patterns, round things. Throughout childhood, everywhere you go, you see round shapes, bubbles, balloons, and balls, and hula hoops, and merry-go-rounds, and Ferris wheels, and even children themselves are round, right? They're like rounder versions of adults, and that has to do with the biology, that they have a higher percentage of body fat. It's what gives them those cute, pinchable cheeks, but there's something about round shapes that seems to bring joy everywhere we go. Bright color, pops of bright color. If you go to a festival anywhere around the world, you'll see color. You might see different costumes, different foods, different decorations, but there'll always be bright, vivid color. Symmetrical shapes and repeating patterns. A sense of abundance and multiplicity. A sense of lightness or elevation. When I looked at it this way, I saw all of these patterns, I realized that yes, the feeling of joy is mysterious and elusive, but we can actually access it through tangible physical attributes, or what, as a designer, I learned to call aesthetics. And aesthetics, I think that word can often be a little bit loaded, right? So we associate it with art, we associate it with beauty. But it comes from much simpler origins. It comes from the same root as the Greek word aesthenome, which means I feel, I sense, I perceive. What these patterns were telling me is that joy begins with the senses. That's the simplest way to think about it. Joy begins with the senses. And so I started calling these things aesthetics of joy, the sensations of joy. And I gave them names that related to the kind of joy they seemed to elicit. And I started to notice more of them. So, for example, freedom, the joy we find in open nature and open space, wide open spaces, and wildness. Magic, the joy we find in things we can't quite pin down, things that are a little bit elusive, like the iridescence on the wing of a butterfly, or the shimmering of the northern lights overhead. Surprise, the aesthetic we find in contrast and the unexpected. Celebration, very much like the happy dance and these dancing tube men, right? When we are in a moment of joy, it feels like it's going to burst out of us. And we often see bursting things, piñatas and fireworks and the pop of a champagne cork. We often see those shapes at celebrations. And renewal, the joy we find in blossoming and growth and expansion. So altogether, I identified 10 of these aesthetics of joy, and this became like a palette for me. Each of these is a trigger that we can find in the world around us that can elicit more joy within us. And in the wake of noticing this, I started to notice something else, that as I walked around, I started noticing little moments of joy everywhere I went. It was like I had a secret code for joy. I had stumbled on the decoder ring. And now that I knew what it looked like, I was seeing it everywhere. And I started to call this joy spotting because it was it was almost like a mindfulness practice, a way of intentionally seeking out and noticing joy that I could find in the world around me. It's something I do now, and you can do it anytime. You can do it on your commute. You can do it while walking your dog. I know families now do it on the way to school in the morning. But it's a way of bringing, noticing joy and bringing that into your day-to-day. And of course, I put a hashtag on it. If you're having a bad day, I highly recommend this hashtag because it's a place to go to see people who are sharing joy, who simply want to share more joy with each other. So this was great. Joy spotting was great, and I was really, I was finding more joy, noticing more joy. But I also started to notice something else, which is that if these are the things that bring us joy, why are they so missing from so many of the places that we spend most of our time? So why do we go to work here? Most of us go to offices that look like this. Why? Why do we send our kids to schools that look like this? Why do our cities look like this? And I think this gets a little bit more poignant when we start to look at the places that house the most vulnerable people in our society, the people who don't really have a choice about where they get to be. So nursing homes, hospitals, homeless shelters, housing projects. When people are down on their luck, when they're ill, when they're old, that is, where we put them. And so I wanted to understand, how did we end up in a world that looks like this? Because the thing is, we all start out joyful. I mean, you can look at kids and you know this, right? No kid needs to be taught how to feel joy. It's natural. It just comes easily. And yet, as we grow older, being colorful, being exuberant, being joyful, these things open us up to judgment. When adults act in a way that is exuberant, that's playful, that's silly, when we wear bright colors, we risk being dismissed as childish, as unserious, as superficial or frivolous or too feminine. And so we start to hold ourselves back from joy, right? And we separate work and play. We feel like we have to dress our age and act our age. And we push joy out to the weekends and to vacations, if we take them. In the US, we don't take all our vacations. I feel like less of a problem with that here. But we stop making space for it in our lives. And I think it's really important to understand where this comes from, that this is a deep cultural bias, and especially for Western cultures. So Goethe, in his theory of colors in 1810, he made this observation. He says, savage nations, uneducated people, and children have a great predilection for vivid colors, whereas people of refinement try to avoid them, try to actually banish them from their presence. And I feel like this actually, is often true today. We have a sort of an aesthetic of minimalism that often has ties to, morality, and that to be minimal is somehow to be, more in control, more reserved, and in some way superior. And then Adolf Loos, writing at the beginning of the modernist movement, he says, freedom from ornament is a sign of spiritual strength. And this was in a lecture called Ornament and Crime. And he's basically making that equation. It's a moral equation. And what he's really putting down are these highly embellished indigenous crafts, many of which were practiced by women, that he says, indulge in decoration. So again, it's an indulgence to have vibrant color and a sense of abundance in the world around us, and to want that in our surroundings. And so I think what happens is there's an equation being built that to be joyful, to express joy in through color, through abundance, the most sort of obvious ways we can do it, is to be wasteful, or is to be childish, or is to be unsophisticated. And so what happened is we pushed joy to the edges of our world, physically. So joy gets to live on playgrounds, on beaches, in amusement parks, on nature preserves, and the rest of the world was left to look like this. And so this got me wondering about how we could bring more joy back into the center of our world. Like, is there a way, are there people who have done this, who've taken this man-made environment that we have, that we've stripped of all the joy, or banished all the joy, and brought it back? And it led me to a story that, when I first heard it, I couldn't even believe it was true. It takes place in the Albanian capital of Tirana in 2000. It begins in 2000. Tirana had been in a steady decline for about 10 years since the fall of communism, and the city was rife with corruption and organized crime, and the city was so bankrupt that they couldn't even afford to pick up the garbage, so garbage just piled uncollected in the streets. And in 2000, Tirana elected a new mayor named Edi Rama. Edi Rama was an artist by training, and he didn't have much money to work with, but what he did, he used to do this. he started painting vibrant designs on all of the downtown buildings in Tirana. Public buildings, private buildings, it didn't matter. It's kind of funny to imagine, your landlord waking up and finding the mayor has just painted his building with like rainbows all over it and he can do nothing about it. He just went for it. And what he found was right after this began, people stopped littering in the streets. And then the shopkeepers started to remove the metal grates from their shopfront windows. They said that the streets felt safer, even though there were no more police on the streets than before. And of course, the mayor knew that there were no more police on the streets than before because he couldn't afford to pay any more police. And then people started to pay their municipal taxes. Something that years of enforcement hadn't been able to get people to do. Now people were paying their taxes. So now he has resources. He's able to plant trees, refurbish the city parks, clear illegal buildings out of the way. And 5 years later, after this began, the number of businesses in Tirana had tripled, and the tax revenue had increased by a factor of 6. And 10 years after, Tirana was named the top of the Lonely Planet's most desirable destinations. So this was a city where no one wanted to be, and it went to a city where everyone wanted to be in the span of just a decade. And it all started with color. And so this seemed too much for me to believe. But when I started to dig into it, I found that there were others doing similar things. So for example, Public Color, a nonprofit in New York City that goes into underserved New York City schools and transforms them with vibrant color. And what they've found when they talk to principals at these schools is that kids say they feel safer in these schools, that attendance, student and teacher attendance improves, and that graffiti disappears. So many of the same things are happening across both of these stories. Trying to understand why this might be the case, I found a study, a couple of studies. One study showing that people working in more colorful work environments are more alert, confident, and friendly than people working in drab spaces. And this study was conducted across countries as diverse as Sweden, Argentina, and Saudi Arabia. So very diverse cross-cultural study. And then a study recently out of Vancouver that measured a really significant sort of metric of emotional health and well-being in cities. And this measure is this: if you were standing in this spot, in a particular spot in a city, and you lost your wallet, you dropped your wallet, how likely are you to believe that it will be returned to you? And what they found is that when people are standing near rainbow crosswalks, they're much more likely to believe that their wallet is going to be returned to them than when they're standing next to a regular plain old crosswalk. So something is happening that makes the surroundings feel more alive. And I think that, we can draw a tie to some evolutionary explanations. So one of the theories behind the evolution of our color vision is that it evolved to help us find ripe fruits and young leaves in the treetop canopy for our primate ancestors. And so I think on a very primal level, when we see a pop of bright color, our unconscious minds treat that as a sign of life, a sign of energy. And I think the same is true of our love of abundance. So we evolved in a world where scarcity was dangerous and abundance meant survival. And so that's why one confetto, which is the singular of confetti, one confetto isn't very joyful, right? It's just detritus, you'd pick it off your shoe. But multiply it and you have a handful of one of the most joyful substances on earth. And you can see this in action in the work of Emmanuelle Moreau, who is an architect working in Japan. This is a nursing home she designed, and this is the room where residents visit with their families. And what the administrator of this nursing home told me is that families visit longer in this space since it was redesigned. And some of these aesthetics of joy have even been traced to specific parts of our nervous system. So neuroscientists have taken people into fMRI machines and they've shown them pictures of angular objects and round ones. You remember all those round shapes of childhood that we find so joyful. And what they found is that when people look at angular objects, a part of the brain called the amygdala lights up. And that part of the brain is associated in part with fear and anxiety. But it stays silent, stays quiet when we look at curves. And what they speculate is that because we evolved in a world where many sharp shapes often were associated with danger, we evolved an unconscious sense of caution around these shapes, whereas curves naturally set us at ease. And you can see this in the newly redesigned Sandy Hook school building. So after the mass shooting in 2012 in Newtown, Connecticut, it was one of the worst mass shootings in U.S. history, where many children and also teachers lost their lives. They wanted to redesign the building from the ground up, and they didn't want it to. Of course, they wanted it to feel safe. That was essential, but they also wanted it to be joyful, and so they filled the building with curves. So there are waves that run the length of the building, there are these squiggly canopies over the entryway, and the whole building actually bends toward the entrance in a welcoming gesture. So I think when we think about if something's wrong and we want to fix it, and we're not feeling well and we want to we're feeling anxious, or feeling stressed, or we're feeling depressed, we always look to what's happening inside. But I love this quote because I think it really speaks to the fact that we never look at the other kinds of explanations, right? When a flower doesn't bloom, you fix the environment in which it grows, not the flower. You add fertilizer, you add water, you check the sunshine, if it has enough sunshine. And we're not flowers. But there are a lot of ways in which our environments affect us. And so what I want to talk about now are some of the ways that we can all take this forward for ourselves. What can we do at our own homes, our own lives, our own workspaces to bring more joy right where we are? And so the first one, I think, should be no surprise if you've been sitting here for this long and looking at this presentation, is add a pop of color. I talked about the research on color and alertness, and this research goes, the connection between joy and color goes all the way back to childhood. If you look at children's drawings, when children are drawing happy scenes, they use bright colors. When they're drawing scenes of anger and stress, they use black and brown and gray. Those are the colors they use. So this is something that's very natural. So looking for more color in your environment, both out in the world, tuning your eye to see it, and noticing in yourself how you feel when you're in, different environments, particularly colorful environments or light environments. Notice what's happening in your body and how you're feeling and what your emotional state is, and see if maybe bringing, you don't have to live with rainbow chairs, but maybe just bringing a small pop of color. This is my own home, and this is a bench, a thrifted bench, just transformed with green paint. And for me, this is like a physical welcome in my house. Every time I come home, I feel this same burst of joy at seeing this green bench, because it's bright and it gives me this sort of this little lift. So this is really what this is about, is finding ways to create small moments of buoyancy in your day-to-day by using color, by using different elements. Another way to do it is, doing something even as small as the mug you drink your coffee out of in the morning. Just something you do at your desk. Because I think, if you work in one of those environments that looks like the ones I showed before, it could be impacting your productivity. Research shows that when we work in lean, minimalist work environments, as opposed to in enriched work environments that have art, that have color in them. Studies show that people are actually 15% more productive in the more sensorially stimulating, enriched environments. So even just a little thing that you can do in your own workspace by adding a pop of color. Second, bring the outdoors in. So of course, being out in nature, research shows that does many different things for us, but one of the most important is that it quiets the part of the brain that tends to brood and worry over problems. It's called the subgenual prefrontal cortex. So next time you can't stop thinking about a problem, you're ruminating, that's the part of your brain that you can blame. But going out into nature seems to quiet that part of the activity in that part of the brain. And what's really interesting is that many of us studies show that we underestimate the benefit we're going to get from being out in nature. So if you can get out into nature, that's a great way to do it. But if you can't, bring the outside in. Bringing plants into an environment has been shown to lower blood pressure. It has also been shown to make us more generous to one another. Very simple thing. But certainly for me in my own home, this was the most powerful thing that I did to change my space. It can be so small, you only need one even, and it can have a really big effect. Lighten up. So there's an abundance of research on the way that sunshine affects our emotions and our broader well-being. Sunshine regulates our circadian rhythms. It also regulates our serotonin levels. So it's really interesting. There's research that shows that around now, at the beginning of spring, our serotonin levels are very low. This is one of the most important neurotransmitters involved in mood. And they go up. So by the end of the summer, our serotonin levels are at the highest they are all year. So getting more sunlight, more natural light on a daily basis is really important. Studies also show that when workers have sunnier desks, so if you can get a little bit more light in the workday, that they sleep 46 minutes more per night than when people work in a windowless space. So just having a little more sunlight can affect your sleep. It can have, knock-on effects that affect everything. And you can do this in your own space. Of course, if bringing in both a little bit more natural light, if you can. Artificial light can also work, can also supplement that. Lightening up your walls, lightening up your furnishings to create a sense of sort of brightness and airiness. And now it's interesting that there are certain companies like Philips testing out light fixtures in offices that actually can give the same energy boost as a cup of coffee. So this is just beginning this research, but it I think hopefully forebodes, it sort of bears well for the future that hopefully we'll have these kinds of lighting systems that will allow us to create more energy from the outside in. Of course, make space for play. Play is one of our easiest and most sort of natural access points to joy. And I think, especially for those of us who don't have kids, kids become a portal to play. But for those of us who don't, finding space for play in everyday life can be really important. And I think that, one of the ways to do this through decor is actually going back to that research about the angles and the curves, bringing more curves into a space. I think that we often think of play as childish, but it doesn't have to be. This is the Wing, which is a women's co-working and community space in New York, and they've sort of rounded all the edges on the furniture, and it just creates this very sort of light and safe space, safe feeling space, joyful space, without feeling, too childish or childlike. Add an element of surprise. So when I was doing my closet, I wanted to have something in there that would bring me joy every day, every time I opened it. So we painted stripes, cabana stripes on the back of the closet. And that is, it's just a really simple thing that you can do to make a space feel more layered, right? If you don't want to live with bright colors all around you, totally understand that. Not everyone wants that. But by putting things in tucked away spaces, your drawers, like, having patterned drawer liners, having socks that you wear inside your shoes that you just get a little peek of. Little moments of surprise can be a way to add a kind of joyful freshness to a space. And then lastly, celebrate the little things. So I talked about how celebrating things together can actually deepen and strengthen relationships. Now you can do this through things like a happy dance. My husband and I actually do happy dances on Fridays. It's one of the ways that we celebrate the weekend. But it's also a good way to celebrate an achievement. It's a way of making celebration tangible, right, and physical. But you can also do that by, hanging a garland over your workmate's desk when they have something to celebrate. And there are lots of little things that you can do to bring more celebration into the everyday. A woman that a friend of mine who runs a company called Tatley, she actually has a confetti drawer in her office that's there and ready for impromptu celebrations. So I think there are lots of ways to bring this principle in a physical way to remind you to celebrate everything. So I think for a lot of us, we think of joy as extraneous, as the icing on the cake. That's how we've been made to feel about it. And what I'm hoping you take away from this is actually that it's not extraneous. It is an essential drive that we've all evolved to have to guide us toward the things that will help us thrive. And there's a custom I just want to share that I learned about while I was researching my book, that the Native American, the Dene Native American people practice. And they're also known as the Navajo. You may have heard either of those names. And the custom is that they celebrate a baby's first laugh. So it happens usually at about 3 months of age. They celebrate that moment when a baby first laughs. The person who made the baby laugh has to throw a party with the baby and co-host it together. And then they stand there and they offer gifts together. And it's a very sweet custom. But I think the meaning behind it is what really is poignant for me. The Diné people believe that it's at that moment when the baby first laughs, that the spirit of that baby has committed to being human, has decided to stay here on earth. That up until that point, they're still checking things out, right? Not sure. And that's the moment when they've said, no, I'm going to be here through all the ups and downs of life. I'm going to be here. And the laughter is the signal that spirit has chosen to be here. And I think that's the thing. When we sideline joy, when we push it to the edges of our world, we forget that it is an essential, it's a critical part of our humanity. So I'd encourage you to go out there, spot joy, share joy, embrace it. And I would love to continue this conversation with you. We'll be at C20. I'll be signing books and can chat more there. And here's how you can find me. Yes, thank you so much.